So, Renato, why is Jack Smith asking Judge Chutkin for more time to consider all of his options?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, before we begin, if you're listening here, you're actually one of our YouTube viewers, and I just wanted to let you know that we have switched podcasting networks. And that is, I think, in part due to some of the comments that many of you have left here on the YouTube channel. So, one of your comments that I think has been, and it's sort of been a repeated one, is that um, you have felt that there hasn't been a quick turnaround time in terms of some of our conversations. And so we have now switched to the Really American Network. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to have conversations together, and you're going to see the results very quickly. Not only in our regular podcast feed, which people who are just listening to the audio will, but you'll actually see the video on the Really American YouTube channel very, very quickly thereafter. And then you'll be able to see the same content here on our channel 24 hours later. So that was the agreement we reached with them, so that this way we would be able to get content out much faster than we've been able to get out in the past.
And I was going to say, Renato, that this initially seemed like something that was going to be necessary with a lot of, fast breaking developments, et cetera, which kind of brings us to our topic today, uh, which is that maybe things are not going to move as quickly on certain fronts as we thought they might.
So, Asha, yeah, have to say this has been an interesting development. We all thought that there was going to be a lot happening in the courtroom over the last, months leading up to the election, particularly in the January 6th case. And there's been a lot of people on cable news who've been speculating that there's going to be a mini trial in the district court before Judge Chutkin, that's going to essentially preview all the evidence before the election. And there was a long awaited filing, and Jack Smith literally made a filing and said, yep, we need more time. Please give us 3 more weeks to figure out what we want to do. And Trump's team doesn't object.
Yeah, it seemed like the January 6th case was sort of the last one standing that was going to maybe go anywhere. It's sort of like the legal murder on the Orient Express, and then there was one, the January 6th case, and yeah, and I think a lot of the commentary was that even in the aftermath of this atrocious and horrifying and somewhat cryptic Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that Jack Smith might actually have a revised indictment somehow ready to go to move forward, having cleaned it of all of any questionable official acts and ready to move. And that's clearly not what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, to be the most charitable interpretation is, a lot of people may have been reading into the fact that Jack Smith has been very gung ho about moving forward as quickly as possible and really streamlined the indictment in the January 6th case in order to ensure that it could go forward before the election. But that said, I have to say I strongly disagreed with a lot of that analysis. And I think it's a great example of kind of some of the echo chamber problems there can be with legal analysis, where you've got all these people hyping themselves into thinking there's going to be some sort of mini trial. And it's like, why? Like, why would the Justice Department be rushing before the election to present a whole bunch of evidence in a hearing about about what's immune and what's not immune? I didn't really see a good reason why the Justice Department would want to be rushing to do that before the election, or why a prosecutor would necessarily want to put the evidence, like the witnesses, for example, on the witness stand, when they could just submit some briefs that summarize things, and try to get a ruling from the judge that way.
Yeah, so let's rewind because I think you and I are in the weeds on this, and people may not know what we're referring to with mini trial and all this stuff. So, as you'll recall, a couple of episodes ago, not just in the podcast, but in the saga of our American political life, the Supreme Court handed down this opinion on presidential immunity. And essentially, in my opinion, eviscerated kind of the main area in which you might be able to hold a president accountable by creating this paradigm of official acts versus non-official acts, and absolute immunity and presumptive immunity and all these complicated things, which they kind of threw out there, didn't really define with any clear precision. But in terms of the January 6th case, more or less said, and Judge Chutkan, you can figure it out, and then we'll take a second look later and figure out if you got it right. And so the idea is that there's all these loose categories. There's no real clarity on, except with a few exceptions that the Supreme Court mentioned, on which acts actually fall in which buckets. And so it seemed like there might be I would say three alternatives, right? One is that Jack Smith was playing, 5D chess and already knew that this is exactly how the Supreme Court was going to come down, and had, as I mentioned earlier, some sort of cleaned up version of an indictment that would not implicate this whole issue and be able to move forward. That was probably unlikely because there's a lot of stuff that is gray area. The second possibility was that then they were going to have to engage in this fact finding on which acts fall in which category and what's immune and what's not immune, as you said. And what you're referring to is that there were some legal commentators who said, aha, we can use this as a mini trial where basically we'll use this factual determination and this hearing to air out all this evidence that ultimately might not be able to come in. Because again, the Supreme Court said it's not only that you can't prosecute someone for official acts, you can't actually use it as evidence, even in the prosecution. And what maybe we didn't see coming was this third possibility, which is where we are now, where Jack Smith has sort of said, well, yeah, I need more time.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. One thing I will just say is, what it suggests to me is that within the Justice Department, there's not a lot of enthusiasm about rushing into this right in the middle of an election season. Like, everyone's paying attention to the presidential race. So much has happened. We've talked about that in our last episode. And here we are. And suddenly, do we really want to take attention away from that and put it onto a court case? And I think draw a lot of vitriol from folks in the United States, the public and the press and so on, saying, hey, why is the Justice Department making itself center stage in a criminal case center stage in this election? I just see that not being what the Justice Department wants or what they're looking for. It kind of gives the Justice Department leadership an opportunity to weigh in here, and say, hey, Jack Smith, I know we gave you this authority and you're running with it, but hey, we don't necessarily want this to happen. And by the way, it's not usually what a prosecutor would want to do. In other words, Asha, if you give a prosecutor a choice, typically they're not going to want to show their hand. They're not going to want to put witnesses on. They're not going to want to preview evidence. They're just going to want to make some filings, say, yep, this is what we're going to do. See a trial. That's usually what prosecutors do. On the defense side, now that I've been on the defense side, of course, I want first crack at all the witnesses. That's exactly what I want. I want to have one crack with them before the jury comes out, test all my best questions, see what works, see what doesn't, and toss out the losers and come back for round two when the jury's around. But I don't, I think, and I think candidly, if the defendant's name wasn't Donald Trump, if it was like Donald Mariotti or Donald Rangappa, I think that's where we would be. But of course, the defense here is happy to just kick the can down the road.
So you believe that Smith is asking for this time because then why ask for 3 weeks? Why not just indefinite? You know what I'm saying? Like if the concern is we really don't want to move forward on this as we're getting so close to an election because it's going to basically not only put a spotlight on this instead of the election, but maybe also create the implication that we're trying to influence the election or something, then why 3 weeks? And 3 weeks from now, you're just closer to the election.
Yeah. And you're closer to the election. And so your proposed timeline for briefing and so on and so forth is even, you're able to, I think, put it further down the road. I suspect what's going to happen is the proposal is going to be like they'll ask for more time. Maybe there's some disagreement, and we could talk about that within the Justice Department. That's certainly possible. They certainly are going to try to consider this very carefully. They may ask for another, to have another joint request for more time. But I think ultimately they're going to make sure that they don't give Judge Judkin the option of having a big hearing before the election. That's what I suspect. I suspect that they're going to try to get it done via briefing.
I want to explore some other hypotheses though, because if that were the case, I feel like we would have also seen signals before Judge Cannon throughout the documents case. I mean, in other words, if the issue was we don't want to be engaging in litigation close to the election, I feel like that concern would have surfaced in some way before now. Like, it's just, why does the Supreme Court decision change that when they were moving full speed ahead before? Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. I actually think it's a really smart and incisive question.
Thank you.
And here's my thought on that, because I hadn't considered it that way, but I think there's something to that. But here's what I'm thinking, Asha, is that at some point in time, quite a while ago, right, there was a decision made by Garland to put these cases, multiple matters, in the hands of Jack Smith. Jack Smith was super gung ho, super speedy, super aggressive, and he is supposed to consult, and you know the regs better than I do. He's supposed to consult with Garland as to quote major decisions, right?
Correct.
Right. Well, these little filings that he's making, I don't know if he's even consulting with Garland about small filings over motions and things like that in the Mar-a-Lago case. And I don't know if Garland feels comfortable trying to insert himself into that case and be perceived as trying to sort of give commands to Smith. But I suspect that after the Supreme Court immunity decision, that now this has come back, like this has caused Smith to come to Main Justice and say, what parts of this decision or what parts of this indictment survive now that we have the Supreme Court decision, and what should I proceed on? And now what we're seeing is we're not seeing Jack Smith's indecision. We're seeing Merrick Garland making a choice here. Like, he now has the ball in his court. So he's going to take a sweet time making a decision, which I think is a very ponderous former judge. That's maybe more of his personality. But I also think he's not in any hurry to give an answer to Jack Smith that's going to send Jack Smith to the races.
I think this might be a more plausible answer. So the special counsel regulations require the special counsel to get approval from the attorney general for major prosecutorial decisions. So the special counsel, the attorney general does not engage in what the regulations call day-to-day supervision. In other words, the attorney general can't micromanage, can't be, like, oh, you have to change the word on that brief, and as you said, maybe even some of these more minor motions. But yes, I think this makes sense because it would not only be, for example, if he did have like kind of a rewritten indictment, like I feel like that would be something that he'd need to clear again or something. It could also be, the Department of Justice as an institution needs to kind of take a position in light of this new court decision on where it stands, on what it's going to prosecute or not prosecute. Because the Department of Justice has its own internal policies on how it treats a prosecution of a sitting president. So there might be policy stuff. So to me, that seems more plausible that there is some tension there, or that this is Merrick Garland sitting on it and having to, ponder the meaning of life um, before moving forward.
So, I think actually, Asha, another plausible explanation that I could see somebody offering here is that, along the lines of what you just said, that there are all these internal stakeholders at the Justice Department that need to weigh in. So, for example, the Solicitor General's office has to weigh in because they're going to have to defend this before the Supreme Court, and the Civil Rights Division is going to, want to weigh in regarding the portion of the indictment that relates to them, and so on and so forth. And that's really what's causing the delay. But my view is, if the Justice Department really wanted to move quickly, like, they could get all their ducks in a row and figure it out. And I really think that, and that's why I just want to make this clear to our listeners and viewers here, that I think that this is a more considered view by Garland, that he wants to take his time. He wants to be in no hurry. He doesn't want to give not only Judge Chutkan, but maybe Jack Smith the ability to race forward quickly. And so I think more time is in his interest here in terms of advancing the interests of the Justice Department, which is usually not to get involved in the middle of an election.
Yeah. And I think it is worth noting that the Department of Justice, typically when it's looking at its own policies or what it's going to do, is often looking at the impact on the institution of the presidency, or the office of the presidency, not just the person that they're prosecuting. So I think a good example here is where the Justice Department, for a while at least, continued to defend Trump in the E. Jean Carroll defamation case, right? Not because I think any of the lawyers really loved doing that or thought that the substance of it was, worth defending, but because the principle behind it, and I think you and I talked about this in one of our earlier podcasts, of, the position that they were taking, that, statements made in the course of, the president's official duties ought not be subject to, defamation lawsuits, because then basically that could impact the entire, it could paralyze the whole office. They eventually, stopped holding that position when Trump started making the same statements, even after he left office. But my point is that there might be something about that has been that the Supreme Court's decision has triggered some of those concerns of, if we move forward prosecuting XYZ in this particular factual circumstance, are we then kind of committing as a department that we agree that a president can be prosecuted in XYZ circumstance? And, what does that mean for the office of the presidency? That's my generous interpretation, maybe, which kind of gets to your stakeholders and different perspectives beyond Trump himself.
Yeah, I do think there's probably some debate about that internally. I just feel like, prosecutors are very reluctant to be perceived as being associated with the political process. I know in my former office where I worked in Chicago, there was constant politicians who were being investigated by my former office because there's a lot of alleged corruption in Chicago and in Illinois. And it was always a concern about being interfering in the political process, doing that too close to an election and so on. And I just think it's not going to seem natural to Merrick Garland and other senior members of the Justice Department to be getting this deep into evidence and allegations and so on, having something that distracts the country from a presidential election, literally just in the last few months of that election. And realistically, I think if you're listening to this and you're really upset, and I know I'm anticipating the fact that we're going to get a bunch of comments on our YouTube, and you can't comment, we do read them, as you could tell. You get a bunch of comments by people saying this is awful, and you're letting this guy go, and this and that. I think that you should always question whether or not you really thought that the legal system and the criminal justice system should be the way of resolving whatever we needed to resolve regarding the presidency with Donald Trump. He is a danger without a doubt to not only, I would say, our institutions, but to our constitutional system. And that, candidly, was always going to get resolved through political means, in my view. It was very, very difficult to see the criminal justice system fully resolving that, because candidly, he could have run for office even if he was in prison. Eugene Debs did it, and so could he. So I'm not entirely shocked that this is where we end up, but it just means that the stakes for the election are even more important.
Well, I'll just disagree. I don't think that the election really should be a factor, to be honest. I think the ship has sailed. I think if they were deciding whether or not to bring the indictment at this point, after like months and months of investigation and we don't know what was going on, that would be one thing. But that the ship has sailed. He's under suspicion. Everybody knows this. But I do think that you are right that may be something that's playing a factor with Merrick Garland, and I wonder if Jack Smith maybe disagrees. And one thing I'll note is, and I don't know if it would apply in this type of disagreement, but if there is a disagreement, if Jack Smith wants to move forward, and somehow Merrick Garland is saying no, or needs more time and might ultimately say no, I believe that's something that has to be reported to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. In other words, when the Attorney General does not approve an action requested by the special counsel, there's a sunlight mechanism, so that the Attorney General can't like kind of secretly bury stuff. Like if we, not that Merrick Garland is trying to bury stuff, but if you have like a Bill Barr type of person, it creates a channel to ensure that those decisions have daylight.
And this is an example of the sort of way in which lawyering works in the real world, is that I suspect, first of all, Merrick Garland and the Justice Department leadership are not going to regard this as taking a different position than Jack Smith wants. Jack Smith right now is asking him for approval to do whatever. They're taking their time to consider that request. And so I suspect this is sort of like they don't even need to take a position. And by not taking a position, there's nothing to report. And potentially, I will just say, even if they did say, well, we think you should just ask for more time, or, whatever they end up saying, then he's going to have to make a tough choice of like, how is he going to characterize that? Is he going to really describe this in writing to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees as, I wanted to proceed 5 weeks faster than they did? Or is he going to just regard this as a discussion of timing, where they discussed what the best timing would be, and he wasn't really staking out a position or asking for authorization? I also have just got to say, Asha, just to be clear to everyone, so I don't get a lot of angry posts and emails and tweets and emails. I'm not saying that a former president shouldn't be indicted, and I'm not saying that a former president can't be held accountable. But it's one thing indicting somebody and then the defense dragging it out until right before the trial out until right before the election. That's one thing. Okay, and that's kind of what was happening here in this case. It's another thing for the prosecution to get handed back a case and say, you know what, we're going to have like a show trial where it's not an actual trial, but it's just sort of like a hearing where we're going to put on a bunch of evidence that we might not otherwise put on. That to me feels very much like doing something you wouldn't ordinarily do. And I'm very much of the view that you should treat him like you treat another defendant, and I don't see a prosecutor ever wanting to do that.
Okay, well, we just can agree to disagree because it's something. If they were to the extent that they would be doing something they don't ordinarily do, it's because the Supreme Court has treated Trump like no other defendant. They have carved out a special status for him, and they've forced the Department of Justice or the special counsel in this case to have to make these determinations. I mean, it just seems weird that it's like the Supreme Court forces them into a corner and then it's like, oh, you're doing something really crazy that no other prosecutor would do. Well, of course they're doing it because the Supreme Court gave this crazy opinion.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't disagree with that. Although I would say that the typical prosecutorial approach would be, yep, here's our proposed new indictment, and here's I've attached as exhibits a bunch of FBI reports detailing what witnesses are going to say, or summaries thereof. Figure it out. Figure it out, Judge. I wouldn't put my witnesses in the stand.
Yeah, and they don't have to. They can still move forward without doing that.
I have no problem with that. I think that's where this is going to end up, by the way, just as a prediction. I think that there's going to be no hearings, before anytime soon. I think they're going to say, here, they're going to take a little time. Then they're going to say, let's set a briefing schedule, and they're going to put it all in writing. And there's going to be some legal filings, and she's going to make a decision on the filings, and that's it.
We'll see.
So, Asha, lately there have been a lot of growing concerns, particularly, I should say, because the race has certainly gotten a lot closer and is moving in the trending in the Democrats' direction. That Donald Trump might once again try to delegitimize the electoral process and may try to overturn the results of the election yet again.
Yeah, it's really important to listen to the narratives that he's seeding right now. I mean, we know from previous elections. So let's go back to 2016. Well before the 2016 election, probably around this time in 2016 or even before, he was already calling that election rigged. Remember, I think he believed he was going to lose,
right.
And he was setting it up already. In fact, Stop the Steal was something that was conceived by Roger Stone back in 2016. So they were ready to put that operation into effect then, and then they were completely shocked, that everything went, I guess, according to plan, and he, or maybe according to Russia's plan, but he won. And then as the January 6th committee noted, in advance of the 2020 election, he was casting doubt on mail-in voting. He was already seeding the narrative that if it took too long to call the election, that meant it was rigged, because he knew that because of the higher number of mail-in votes, it was going to take longer to call it. So the idea was to prematurely declare victory and then basically call anything that contradicted that after the fact as illegitimate. So I agree with you. And I think one thing that I've noticed is that he has been seeding this idea that somehow Kamala Harris's candidacy is unconstitutional.
Right, without specifying why or how that might be. It reminded me actually a little bit of what he was trying to do to President Obama, suggesting that President Obama was illegitimate. And I wonder if it also kind of goes into the sort of subtle racism or not so subtle racism, right? Where it's like, okay, Barack Obama is not white, so therefore, he's not a naturally born citizen of the United States, or here she's unconstitutional somehow. I mean, I don't know where that comes from.
Well, there is. So John Eastman, back in 2020, during the time that the Democratic primaries were going on, published an article in Newsweek claiming that Kamala Harris could not constitutionally run for president because at the time that she was born, her parents were not naturalized citizens. In other words, they were, I guess, immigrants with green cards or, F1 visas, whatever they had at the time. And he is basically undermining the idea of birthright citizenship, that because her parents were not naturalized citizens, that she could not be considered a natural born citizen, which has literally no basis in law or how it's been applied ever. It was kind of shocking that Newsweek published that. They, by the way, published that without disclosing that John Eastman had run for. He had been wanting to run for Attorney General the year that Kamala Harris ran, but I think he lost in the primary or something like that. In other words, he's bitter. Let's just put it that way. But that I've seen that narrative resurface also. So that could be one of the unconstitutional bases, quote unquote. And then there's this whole idea of how she became the candidate.
Yeah, so a couple things there. I mean, first, I always find the right wing attacking what you described, and they describe it this way as quote birthright citizenship. I find that so bizarre because if you look at the text of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, it makes absolutely clear that people who are born in the United States are citizens of the United States, and there's just no way around that. That's what the Constitution says. And so all of these people who are crying about that, like that's that is part of the Constitution, and it is just a reality they have to deal with, whether they like it or not. But regarding this whole parties thing, I mean, another thing I find so remarkable with that is, Trump's very bothered by the fact that he's got to deal with Kamala Harris and not Joe Biden as the nominee. And he keeps talking as if this has something to do with the Constitution. The people who wrote the Constitution did not think there was going to be political parties. They did not anticipate political parties. They literally thought that the president and they would be like, everyone would nominate their great white man from their state, and that the person with the first amount of votes would be George Washington, would be the president, and then whoever came in second would be the vice president, basically just sitting around in case the vice president.
Yeah, it's like the beauty pageant runner-up.
Right. Like if Miss America decides that she's out, she quits or she gets sick or something, you've got the runner up. She's the new Miss America or something. Yeah. And so they did not anticipate at all political parties. So the idea that the Constitution has nothing to say about what the Democratic Party internal rules are about how they nominate candidates. The states run their own ballots and have their own ballot access rules. And these political parties have slots on these ballots via various means. And the Democratic Party decides however it wants to decide who its nominee is going to be.
Yeah, he really wants to be running against Joe Biden.
Yeah, and that's apparent.
Sometimes he tweets like he still is. Remember how he kept running against Hillary, like even after 2016?
Yeah.
Like, even he was scared about Joe Biden in 2020, so he kept bringing up Hillary, and it's like Hillary's not running.
Yeah, it's a bizarre thing. He's got his brain stuck.
His brain stuck. But I do think, to your original question / point, it's worth looking ahead to what kinds of legal. I mean, I don't know. I always say that these are crazy things, and like, what could he possibly bring up? But I mean, he claimed absolute immunity, and here we are. So I don't know.
All right, I'm going to make two. I'm going to make two bold predictions, and in other words, predictions I don't usually make.
Okay.
So one is, I think if this race ends up being close enough and Trump loses, and he does raise various challenges and says that the election was stolen, I don't think it gets nearly as far as it did last time. I think that part of the reason that it even had as much traction as it did last time was because, first of all, he was the sitting president. Second of all, no people, while they kind of vaguely knew that this was his playbook, they weren't really ready for it. I do think there's a boy who cries wolf sort of thing, okay, where it's like you've said it once and you were disproven. I think third, I really think the press has sort of come, like all of the education done by the January 6th committee, all the evidence that they uncovered, and all of the discussion of the big lie and so on for many years, I think has the press more attuned to this issue. It's going to look more like sour grapes. Whereas I think they weren't sure what to do with this when the president of the United States is suggesting this and he's saying the Justice Department this and that. Like, I think that they were not 100% sure what to do with it at the time.
I don't disagree with all of that, but I have to be honest, Renato, at this point, I am so skeptical of this Supreme Court. And I feel like they now have an institutional interest in ensuring that Trump as president because there's all these reforms that are coming their way that they clearly don't like. In other words, there's a weird self-preservation thing for themselves that, they're going to be held accountable if, you know, possibly if there's a Democratic president, but definitely if Democrats take the House and the Senate. I mean, I think there is a legitimate fear, and also there's an ideological agenda that they clearly have that they want to implement also. So I am very worried that in the event of a close election, that we could end up with a Bush v. Gore 2.0 of, oh, hanging chads or whatever, and some some rationale that's going to weirdly only apply to the specific case in front of them and have no precedential value. But wow, magically it makes Trump the victor. So, I mean, I think the only insurance against that is that it has to be a landslide. It has to be a landslide.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to just say you're the sad panda of the podcast now. Okay,
I'm conspiracy panda now. I'm conspiracy panda. I'm Supreme Court conspiracy panda.
You're Supreme Court's conspiracy panda. And then I'm just going to give my other bold prediction on this. Here's what I think. I think if Trump loses, small or big, there's going to be some local Republican MAGA official somewhere who wants to contest something or another related to the certification of the electoral votes or regarding who the electors are or something or another. I could be wrong, but he's installed so many of these folks or encouraged so many of these folks across the country that I'm going to be hopeful for a change in this podcast and hope that it will draw attention to the fact that our system right now has a number of procedural parts to it that made a lot of sense back in the days when we weren't focused on national elections being truly national elections, and we didn't even have a popular vote really, because you had these electors were sometimes selected in different ways, maybe even back in the days when the senators weren't popularly elected. But I do think that, if we end up in a situation where, let's say, Kamala Harris wins soundly across the country, but we still have some guy in Arizona, local official, claiming that the electoral votes are one way or the other, that might draw some attention to the fact that these local, local party officials matter, that elections are administered at a state by state level, and that maybe we really need to consider some federal safeguards in federal elections so that we ensure that our elections aren't called into question without any merit or evidence in the future.
I agree.
So, Asha, what people aren't hearing if they're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube is that we've had a number of interruptions today. What is going on in the Rengappa household?
Well, I am in Vermont. There's a little sign here. I'm in Quechee, Vermont. You can see that little sign behind me, which is a lovely town. Just kind of getting away for the week, getting some work done, retreating. But I got a call from my daughter, and I hear this fire alarm going off. She's in my house, and she's like, "What's the code for the ADT?" And so I gave it to her. It doesn't turn off. And then, it's like going off and I'm not there. Unfortunately, I'm not there. The cat's not there, but my daughter was in the house. I was like, you probably should get out of the house unless, but I was trying to figure out like what to do, because obviously it's not fun when you're not at home and your fire alarm is going off.
Yeah. So first of all, message to all would-be stalkers: she's got security at home. Okay.
Yes.
Now that and in Vermont as well. Now that we know the location of you in Vermont.
Oh, right. Thank you.
For all these would-be assassins or creepsters. But in all seriousness, it is, it's an interesting thing. We had a similar issue in our house recently where all of our fire alarms started sounding around the same time. We had all our CO2 alarms, and it was just, I think the prior owner replaced all the batteries at the same time, and they all kind of pooped out around the same time. And so it seemed like a big deal. We had all these firemen here, and then, it got resolved.
Yeah. It is like that's like one of my greatest fears though, is like I'm not home and then like everything burns down.
Well, it's such a fear, I would say, for me with Henry, my dog. And I don't know if you saw that viral video where those dogs bit into the lithium ion battery and set the home on fire.
What?
Um, oh yeah, it was like very viral. The dog survived, but if you look for this video of these two dogs bit into a lithium ion battery and set a home in, I think, Nebraska on fire. Like literally, you see the dogs like they're staring at the fire keeps spreading, and then they are running around trying to figure out what to do. They ended up escaping. Thank goodness that they weren't hurt. But it always worries me that, when Henry's home alone, like, he does very well on his own. But, obviously, if there's a fire or something else that happens, I would never want anything to happen to him.
Yeah, same. That's why I was glad that that would have been my first worry, but pancakes here and chill. And then of course I didn't want my daughter in the house. So at that point I was like, I had somebody come and check it out. It turned out it was just a faulty battery, as you said.
Well, I'm glad everyone's safe.